After what seemed like endless driving, we finally made it to Fort Pickens. Fort Pickens is located at the far end of Santa Rosa Island, roughly 10 miles from the main road of Pensacola Boulevard and County Road 399. Once you pass the entrance gate, the road bobs and weaves along the tidy spit of land, which, as my dad and I discovered, is prone to being submerged underwater. Approaching Fort Pickens is quite unique. Your drive takes you inside the main gate, which long since resembles its original structure, having been filled in over the years with sediment buildup and by the Army. So obviously Fort Pickens is on an island, and to get to Fort Pickens, you have to take that road and drive right into the fort. Literally, you're inside the fort when you drive in. But I tell you, it is beautiful and worth it. Ever since its discovery by the Spanish, Pensacola Bay had been considered important along the northern Gulf Coast. Barrancas had been built on the mainland, discussed in a prior video, but Santa Rosa Island had been left unsecured. As an American state, the War Department chose to build a massive brick-and-mortar structure on the island when constructing their third system of defenses along the coast. Working with the Board of Engineers for Coastal Fortifications, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph G. Taunton designed a 5-star fort which Brigadier General Simon Bernard would later make alterations to. After studying Pensacola Bay, Bernard recommended a fortification on the western tip of Santa Rosa Island, soon to be Fort Pickens, one on the eastern tip of Perdido Key, Fort McRae, which now lays submerged, and reinforcing the bluffs on the mainland, Fort Barrancas. It was designed to strike fear in anyone trying to take it, an impregnable fortress, thus its size. 21.5 million bricks would go into the pentagonal structure, allowing for 2 levels and a counterscarp, with walls being 12 feet thick and 40 feet high. 4 of 5 points would defend the water approaches, with the 5th guarding the small portion of land. In August 1828, Captain William H. Chase was assigned to oversee the construction, which would begin in May 1829. 4 years later, the War Department issued General Order 32, naming the fort after American Revolutionary General Andrew Pickens of South Carolina, and in October 1834, it would finally be completed. At the time of its completion, it was the largest brick structure along the Gulf Coast. In 1860, with war on the horizon, Lieutenant Adam J. Slemmer, commanding the forces at Fort Barrancas, realized his position was untenable and made the decision to concentrate all forces from the 3 forts, roughly 51 men, to Fort Pickens. On January 10th, with Florida's secession, the move was made, and 5 days later, a combined force of Florida and Alabama militia demanded the surrender of the fort. It soon became clear that Fort Pickens was not going to be taken, and on January 28th, a truce was reached that Pickens would be left alone as long as it would not be reinforced. Newly elected President Abraham Lincoln, however, pledged at his inauguration to continue to hold any federal structure that resided in the seceded South. The microscope would focus on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor and Fort Pickens in Pensacola. A ship loaded with supplies was soon dispatched from Fort Monroe in Virginia to Pensacola, but it lay at anchor just offshore after its arrival. As tensions mounted of whether or not Fort Pickens would be resupplied, the militia determined to take matters into their own hands. Nature, however, intervened and delayed any surprise attack that had been prepared until April 12th, when the bad weather finally dissipated. There would be cannon fire, but not at Fort Pickens, as South Carolina militia fired at Fort Sumter and the Civil War was joined. Had it not been for bad weather, the Civil War might have started in Florida. Pickens would soon be resupplied and strengthened, and the U.S. Navy would soon blockade Pensacola Harbor. On October 9th, roughly 1,000 Confederate soldiers would land 4 miles east of the fort and advance to the Union Defense Works. By daybreak, the Confederate forces had retreated. The Battle of Santa Rosa Island would be a minor skirmish, with both sides claiming victory, despite the status quo remaining unchanged. It would also be the first significant land battle in Florida during the Civil War. A month later, on November 22nd, Forts Pickens and Barrancas would exchange heavy cannon fire. According to some reports, roughly 6,000 projectiles were fired across the bay, with about 5,000 coming from Union guns. Supposedly, the reverberations of these guns was so loud it caused dead fish to float to the surface and windows to shatter up to 7 miles away. With the fall of New Orleans, the Confederates would leave Pensacola, allowing the Union to regain control of the harbor and the fortifications. This also allowed for Fort Pickens to become an unlikely stop on the Underground Railroad. The forts would also act as a launching point for raids in the Confederate territory, as well as be used as prisons. This use of Fort Pickens would continue well after the Civil War, with Apache Indians being held during the 1880s, including Geronimo. In the 1890s, renovations were made to Fort Pickens. These included new gun batteries to be spread out around the island and covered by the surrounding terrain. A new underwater minefield surrounding the fort was also installed. The first of these new gun batteries would be Battery Cullum, Battery Sevier, and Battery Van Sweringen, all built in 1898. The next year, Battery Pensacola would be constructed inside the main walls of Fort Pickens and would have a unique disappearing carriage. I'm up on top of Battery Pensacola, built in 1898 to reinforce the old crumbling structure of Fort Pickens. And there's Dad, inspecting the grounds. At the time of its construction, however, a fire in a magazine inside the fort caused an explosion, erupting 8,000 pounds of powder. According to some reports, bricks from the wall were blown across the bay, landing at Fort Barrancas over 1.5 miles away. This wouldn't be the only facelift the fort would receive. A lot of the original fort was filled in to fit the more modern armament, which is why when you drive in through the counterscarp, now the walls are no longer 40 feet high. By 1905, the fort would add 3 more batteries: Payne, Cooper, and Truman. I'm standing up here on top of Battery Payne. In its entire existence as a fort, this is the only time anyone was ever killed, when a gun broke loose from its emplacement and slid down the stairs and killed Private Pap. And there's Dad, watching on, making sure everyone is safe down below. Thanks, Dad. In 1923, another battery would be added to the arsenal at Fort Pickens with Battery Langdon, which would be placed in a casemate fully by 1943. By this time, the entire fort and island would be strengthened to protect against the very real and historically ignored threat of German U-boats. Batteries 233 and 234 would be built to defend opposite ends of Santa Rosa Island, with a command center in between under a reinforced artificial hill to protect from any aerial attacks. Like most all other coastal defense fortifications, there wasn't much of a need for them in a post-World War II world, and so it was deactivated. This is pretty cool. This is something out of a horror movie, though. In 1971, it would become a part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore and the National Park Services. Despite its location, it would survive countless storms and is still in pretty decent shape. Fort Pickens stands as a relic of a time when defenses like this were necessary to protect our country, and the view standing on some of the locations can be mesmerizing. Despite the long drive, it is worth a visit, and there are a lot of nooks and crannies to explore. Fort Pickens is a massive complex, and I'm not sure if my video is going to do it justice. So if you ever get the chance, I would definitely come over here and check it out. If you enjoyed this video, check out my others on my YouTube page, and look out for some more videos from my trip to the Gulf and Mississippi. Don't forget to like and subscribe, as well as follow me on Twitter at Past and Present 4. Thanks for watching. So about 30 minutes away from Fort Pickens is the site of Fort George in Pensacola, and despite being in somebody's backyard, it's actually pretty cool and worth checking out.